njike warume oye, njike oye, njike atawana yoda wakuru wanesiwa charu. Iyo njike atawana yoda wakuru waisiwa tikaze kwao. Ingawa imutanda wepasi netikaze kwao vaigona kutaura naMwari.
Welcome to week 3, day 2. So, got a question. So this is a reading check-in. And a quote from Kwame Ture, who you know historically is Stokely Carmichael, who changed his name to Kwame Ture. History is made only when the oppressed throw off their oppressors, not when individuals make achievements. Different take on history. That is, usually we think about history, and I was thinking about the assigned reading for this week with a long list of kings and stuff like that. Who makes ink? Who doesn't make ink? And what kind of does that mean? So, what are your impressions of the reading, particularly chapter 5, governance and the stability of Kemet? That's an intentionally broad question, and it's based on 2 assumptions, which I'm testing right now. 1, that you've done the reading, and 2, that you thought about it. And the question requires an answer. Anybody. I ain't gonna call on anybody, and I ain't trying to embarrass you. If you haven't done it, then, you know. So then, because we can't have dead air on television, why do you think I picked this book? I did tell you, but when you're reading this, assuming you can stay awake over it, why did I assign this, you think? Like you could ask even. Yes?
Why did you assign this book?
Okay. Well, my standard of reference is when in the evolution of this class, there is an assumption you don't have to actually test to get into this class, right? So it assumes in your entrance that you read at a college level. Now, if we looked at the history of America and what I showed you about the age grade set, you could see that the educational expectations of a 12-year-old in Africa 5,000 years ago, you wouldn't get in high school or until high school. And that was definitely true of America. Okay? By the time you were in 6th grade, a century ago, you were expected to know Greek and Latin, as well as conjugation of sentences in public school. All right, so the book that I used to use was written by, so I've only used black authors. So I used to use Lerone Bennett's Before the Mayflower, mostly because it kind of jived with my own, and that the reading level was basically like for Ebony Magazine, because that's what he used to write for, which meant that it was a 6th to 8th grade reading level. Right? So this, if I may use this as a prop, okay, this guy's been to Africa 80 times. And he's one of the top scholars in his field. And he writes like that. So everything is sourced, it's not his opinion, and some of the things that he's talked about, if you've done, the reading chapter 5, like the last paragraph where he basically says, okay, this is the history of all 30 dynasties. And, Cleopatra, you thought, Cleopatra looks like Elizabeth Taylor. No. She was actually Cleopatra the Seventh. And then, Kemet was conquered by the Persians, and all these people that they used to conquer, they conquered them. Finally, the Romans, finally, they're gone. Or then they're overrun by other folks. So the relevance of this, basically, that was the most extensive chapter that I ever seen, other than pictures of Egyptian architecture, ever, in my reading. That detail. Now, I admit for me, it was hard to read again and stay awake over it, unless I actually recognized the kings and queens. Like, okay, why is he going into this? Why is it all about war? Why is it, conquest? And they built all these monuments, and, Ramses II. So Ramses II had 150 kids. Did you catch that? I mean, if you did the reading, you caught that. Okay? Ramses II had 150 kids. 50 daughters and 100 sons. Oh, well, no wonder they named a condom after him. Okay, I get that. Ramses. I mean, I admit, that was my first thought, right? Like, okay, why are they why do people get named for things? Why, name familiarity, It's like, we haven't gotten to this part in the history, but, Three Musketeers. Okay, that's written by a black guy. But you don't see that. The Count of Monte Cristo was written about his dad, because that's what happened to his dad. But you don't see that in movies. So, if your reality is structured by television or movies, this book is definitely at odds with it. Completely. So you got to think about, all right, what meets the eye, so to speak? The relevance of Kemet to America. So immediately what meets the eye, say your two eyes, one of the obvious is like on the dollar bill. You got pyramids, right? In D.C., the so-called Washington Monument is an obelisk from Egypt. Like, why would America use that symbolism? Why a pyramid? And don't talk about the Illuminati and Masons and all that, okay? I mean, but if we were going to talk about the Masons, all right, understand what the Masons are doing, okay? They're using Egyptian technology as a secret society. Except they're not so much about being racially inclusive, if we're to believe that. But that's what they're using. Like a mason literally works with bricks. But how do you make bricks? Could you make bricks? Do you know how to do that, right? So the obvious, currency, obelisk, who's famous, who's not, who rewrites history, what history can you trust? I mean, so in the reading, it talks about different pharaohs erasing the names of others because they had this belief that you don't exist if your name ain't up there. And the most obvious way to be up there is have your name carved in stone, which means that somebody has to read it, which means there's some basic infrastructure about who's reading and who's not. And how do you make sure that everybody reads in that democracy? Now, the third eye, which for them is real, a real concept. It's not mystical. It's an actual physical organ and a set of capabilities. So what's invisible? The invisible infrastructure. So for example, the Perah, and by the Hebrew name Pharaoh, Perah is the son of God. Notice that motif? Who else is called the son of God in English? Right? There's only one person. Well, the Pharaoh is the spiritual leader, spiritual and political leader of the country, and they rule by divine right, even though they know they're born human. So that son of God. Oh, okay. Well, part of where that idea comes from is Egypt. So the invisible infrastructure also, so I'm not just talking about religious, but who deals with garbage? Sewage. The utilities such as they are. The water system. Who does farm work? What esteem are farm workers held? Because remember, their calendar, the 3 parts of the calendar are basically linked to natural events. The flooding of the Nile, then planting, then harvest. 4 months of each. And starting over and over, right? Who does farm work? I mean, how many of you picked your food? Right. Okay. So, are farm workers held in high esteem in our culture? No. So, you know, just like, well, I didn't say this to this class, but I'll say it to this class. Okay? You are no more than 2 paychecks, if you have a job, no more than 2 paychecks away from being homeless or starving. If you have a medical bill, just like we saw with the crash construct, if you have a medical bill that's like 80 grand, that could break you. Now, we don't have a social safety net. They did. They didn't believe in people starving to death. Now, if you've read Asante, or I encourage you to read Asante, because the reason I assign this is not basically to raise the bar, right? I'm not teaching down to you. I mean, look, I get paid either way. I don't care in one sense, okay? This is a weapon for you. You can pick up on it or not. And the weapon is, there is a relationship between what happened 3,000 years ago when the longest surviving government in human history and now. I'm not making that up. There is a connection. What if you did have to rebuild civilization from scratch? How would you do it? There's a lesson on how to do that. How is what I call invisible education accomplished? If there's a saying from India, if a pickpocket meets a saint, he sees only his pockets. Right? You can't necessarily tell the difference between somebody who's a saint and a regular person unless you can see the halo over their head, right? But you can tell from their actions. You can feel it in their, as we say, vibe. The invisible education. The things that are not necessarily obvious. And that's one of the things when I'm reading Asante in that chapter about all those political leaders, that's not particularly what turns me on about Egypt. I'm more interested in the invisible stuff. Like, how do you maintain all that? How do you get people to be unified to the degree that they are unified? All right? So, like, basically, Asante actually kind of follows the usual thing that you find in Western literature about studying wars. And the only people what's important is who won against a particular war, which king sat on the throne, which queen sat on the throne, on and on and on. So for me, admittedly, it was hard to stay awake over that. Like, what does this have to do? And I thought, okay, wait. Read that again. Wait, did he just say that? I mean, the part about Ramses, the part about King Tut, which, King Tut was, King Tut, right? He was only around for like 9 years. Nothing. But we think he's all famous. And he wasn't even one of the most influential folks. So policies like war. Who decides who we go to war, where we go to war against, who fights in the war? Now, what I say, when I say, because I'm a drug counselor, right? So my field is looking at controlled substances. So taking that, did you get any sense of what their attitude was towards controlled substances? Or what was a controlled substance? That would be no. Give you an example. Our word for this particular drug comes from the Arabic. Are you serious? I know you don't read, it's not in Arabic, but alcohol, right? Anglicized alcohol. Now, what do you need for alcohol technology? And why would it be a controlled substance? First of all, let's back up. What's a controlled substance in our culture? Refined drug, sometimes drugs in its raw form. Right? There are at least two kinds of drugs that we deal with in America, which are, and if I was going to say that, two kinds of drugs, so what would be the distinction?
Legal and illegal?
Right. Who decides? FDA and, let's say the government, okay. And why are certain things made legal or illegal? Money, okay. But what else?
Profit.
Profit, okay. What else?
Benefits they can have.
Benefits they can have, okay.
Harm.
And a harm, right? Risk-benefit ratio, right? Okay. So, except for drugs that have been invented since the early 1900s, and the drugs that we got from Native Americans, every other drug came from Egypt, or was known, or was written about in the so-called Ebers Papyrus, which is not what the comedians called it, but the white guy that discovered it and translated Ebers. The Ebers Papyrus is basically their medical technology. Right? Just like the Rind Papyrus is basically mathematical and science. So alcohol. What do you need for alcohol technology? First of all, how many different kinds of alcohol do we have? Let's say there's two different kinds. Hard alcohol, yes.
And beer.
And beer, okay? What's the principal difference between the two? How are they made?
One has a lot more alcohol percentage.
Okay,
Like the fermentation.
okay. Fermentation, what do you need for fermentation? Yeast, okay. And?
Sugar.
Okay, all right. So, for example, you've seen grapes, right? Grapes are cloudy. Grapes have a microscopic organism on them called yeast, right? And if you remember I don't know how much Greek history you've had, but I remember this from middle school where they depicted these Greeks stomping on grapes with their bare feet. Ew, they're drinking that? You serious? Ooh. Okay, so what they're doing, right, is they're breaking the fruit up, and the cloudy part is the yeast. And so what happens with the yeast eats the sugar and poops alcohol. Right? That's essentially literally what happens. But the alcohol is poisonous to the yeast. And the yeast are killed when the alcohol reaches about 19 or 20%, which is basically your table wine strength alcohol. Right? Beer is brewed, fermentation, all right? Same process, okay, except the yeast eats the sugar and grain and basically creates beer. So there's barley wine style beer, which is about 12%, but most of your beers like Bud or Bud Light are 2 or 3%, right? But alcohol, right? So alcohol is a metabolic poison for us as well as the yeast, but we're bigger than yeast, so we can drink more, right? Now, if you wanted to make, as you put it, hard alcohol, right? You need to be able to concentrate the alcohol. How do you do that? Distill it. What do you need to make a still? Heat and?
The ability to hold it under pressure.
Hold it under pressure, which means what? Metal containment, which means you have metallurgy to make a pressure cooker. So you can't make a still out of gourd. Doesn't work, right? I mean, this may not be obvious. I mean, and I'm just saying, look, if you can build a pyramid, it takes metal to be able to cut a limestone block. Limestone isn't that hard of a rock, but you need to be able to cut it with something stronger than it. That means metal, which means you need to know which rocks to burn to get the copper to make the metal forge to cut the stone. And if you're going to do that, then you're going to have metal cooking pots and eventually metal stills. Right? So distilled alcohol. So alcohol in Arabic means the essence. So what they were looking for is that alcohol in Egypt, distilled alcohol in particular, was a controlled substance. It's not what they called it, but it was a secret known only to the royalty and the priests and the scribes. Because remember, they're already keeping knowledge to themselves by having hieroglyphics and not teaching everybody how to read hieroglyphics. You're a commoner, you get to read the Demotic script. Because we do need you to be literate, but we don't want you knowing everything. All right? So this is a stratified society, just like a pyramid. Have a few people at the top, more people at the bottom. So yeah, there's some cool things about it, but there's some power inequities too. Not anybody can become pharaoh. Right? Just like anybody can become president. Yeah, if you can get corporate America behind you. And you can raise millions of dollars and speak well on television and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so alcohol, the essence. So everybody, the common people had access to beer and wine technology because, the pharaoh can't stop fruit from going bad at room temperature, particularly in a desert. So alcohol becomes a way of preserving some foodstuffs. So everybody has beer and wine, and sometimes, given that alcohol kills bacteria, sometimes drinking beer was actually healthier for you than drinking the water because it killed bacteria. Obviously not as a steady diet, but, right? So it was considered healing. Now, distilled spirits were basically used medicinally because they realized, look, we can't let this secret out. Because, yeah, we could make money from this, but the spirit of the people would be destroyed if you use this too much. So alcohol, distilled spirits, was a secret, a state secret in Kemet. So they had the technology, but they didn't let the technology out except for trained practitioners. And only for medicinal use. And that secret remained a state secret until they themselves were conquered by the Greeks. And that's how distilled alcohol technology got into European culture. So when we talk about, for example, the cultural values around substances,